We're now about halfway through October, and that means that a lot of important corporate earnings releases are about to come out. We're going to be seeing earnings releases from big banks and big tech for the third quarter. And this is a particularly important earnings season because it's going to tell us whether this recession that a lot of people are expecting is actually underway. Economists, of course, have been forecasting a recession for 23 since pretty much 2022, and lately the economic data has not been consistent with that. We've been seeing job gains, GDP increases, and basically a pretty bullish economy. But it could be that there are early indicators in corporate earnings that'll tell us whether a recession is coming, and we're about to find out a little bit about that very soon because we're going to be hearing from the big banks and the big tech companies, two of the most important sectors in the economy. In this video, I'm going to go over what I consider to be 8 or 9 of the most important earnings releases about to come out in no particular order. So first up is JPMorgan, which actually released today. They did a really good job. The revenue was up, earnings were up 35% on a whole firm basis, and 39% on a per share basis. I thought that JPMorgan was going to have good earnings. I think the bank earnings in general are going to be pretty strong with positive earnings growth. But so that was JPMorgan. It was a good one, and the stock rallied after earnings came out. Next after that is Bank of America, and arguably this is going to be potentially a more troubling release for them than for JPMorgan, because Bank of America, as of its last earnings release, had $100 billion or so unrealized loss on its balance sheet. Now, unrealized losses are basically when you own an investment, it goes down in value and you don't sell. It's considered to be a problem for banks because if they were to have to sell them, it would leave them with less liquidity to pay off their depositors. I personally think this risk factor is overstated for Bank of America because even after you adjust its held-to-maturity treasury securities down to fair value, they still have better liquidity than any of the other big four banks. But it's going to be something that investors are going to be looking at, and there might be a little bit of volatility in this stock after earnings come out if that unrealized loss has not gotten smaller. Then after that, we have Tesla, the first of the big tech releases. The big thing to watch for there will be whether their earnings are able to either grow or at least stay flat. Tesla's earnings and free cash flow have been going down due to price cuts, and it's generally expected that will continue into the third quarter release. Then we have Taiwan Semiconductor. The big thing you're going to want to pay attention to there is earnings, because we know how they're doing in terms of revenue. It's going down. They report their revenue every month. There are a lot of factors that go into how much a company earns. If they were able to cut costs, they may be able to beat on earnings, but the revenue performance from Taiwan Semiconductor in the third quarter was relatively poor. The most recent monthly revenue report showed a 13% decrease in sales. Then after that, we have Coca-Cola. This is a stock that's been beaten down this year despite the markets as a whole being fairly bullish. It's really unpopular on FinTwit right now, Coca-Cola stock is. I'm not exactly sure why. I don't follow this one closely. But if the earnings miss expectations, this stock will probably take a beating. Apart from that, I don't have too much to say about it. Then we get into Apple. That'll be an interesting one because people think that Apple has gotten too big now to grow. There was a report out recently that showed that their services growth was 8.6% last quarter, but on the other hand, Mac sales have been declining. Those who are skeptical of Apple stock generally tend to argue that, look, that with the scale it's reached, it can't grow at more than 4 to 6% on the top line. So if its revenue growth exceeds that rate, and if it has any positive earnings growth, that would be taken well. Apart from that, it would probably be taken pretty poorly. Then after that, there's Meta Platforms, which had a really good quarter last quarter. They had positive growth in both revenue and earnings. However, like most of the tech companies, it's going to be more challenging for them in the third quarter because the US dollar made gains in that period, whereas in the second quarter it declined. So their foreign source earnings are going to be less valuable when converted to US dollars. A big thing to watch in Meta's release is going to be the engagement, DAUs, MAUs, and things like that. That refers to how many people are using their services. There's a perception now that Meta Platforms is facing more competition than it did in the past. Things like TikTok, things like even Elon's Twitter. All of this is perceived as being competitive threats to Meta Platforms. Now, that hasn't showed up so far in the company's monthly or daily active user reports, but maybe the third quarter will be the quarter when it finally happens. Who knows? So that'll be one to watch for in Meta's release. Next after that is Microsoft. I think the most interesting thing to watch in that release will be the Bing results, whether it was able to gain any market share or increased revenue or profitability. Microsoft's most recent quarter was actually pretty good. They were one of the tech companies that had a decent amount of growth in revenue and earnings. However, the segment of which Bing was a part actually shrank slightly, which is bad news because they thought that incorporating ChatGPT into Bing search would allow them to take market share from Google, but it didn't really happen. But then again, maybe someday it will happen, and the third quarter release could tell us a little bit about that. So that would be the most important thing to watch in the Microsoft earnings release. Then there's Google's own release, and as you probably figured out from what I said about Microsoft, their market share and revenue and earnings from search will be very important. Google's most recent earnings release was pretty good. They returned to positive growth in revenue and earnings after a few quarters of slowing down or even having negative earnings growth. I also think that the cloud segment will be one to watch in this release because it only turned profitable 2 quarters ago. It still has very high revenue growth, and if EBIT earnings from that segment grow again this quarter, it'll probably be taken very well by the markets. Finally, there's Amazon. This is one of the tech stocks that got beaten down the worst in the 2022 tech bear market. I don't follow this stock all that closely. I will say that investors at this point will want to see positive growth in revenue and earnings because many of its peers, such as Google and Microsoft, are now doing positive earnings growth. I'll also say that the segment performance of Amazon Web Services will be really important because that has been the biggest driver of profit growth at Amazon lately. So there you have it, the 10 most important earnings releases to watch in the third quarter earnings season. I ended up covering more stocks than I actually thought I would. I believe I said 8 or 9 at the beginning, but there's a lot of them releasing this month, and we actually have Apple releasing the month after the end of the previous quarter, which was not the case last time. So there's a good few very important earnings releases coming out. If you own some of these stocks, you'll probably want to watch them, and I'd say there's a good chance you own at least a few of them. But that's it for me today. Happy savings.